needs. So I think my job this afternoon is to just sort of set the stage and to talk to you about why culture matters and why culture matters when we think about medical education and when we think about some of the pedagogical strategies that we're here to be reflecting on and being thoughtful about. Feedback, coaching, assessment. So with apologies to some of you who have no doubt heard my little story before, I want to tell you a story at the top that gives you a bit of a sense of why I find culture such a fascinating influence on learning and why I hope you will as well. So a few years ago I was doing a study where I was able to interview doctors who had a lot of training in other fields of study to try to get a sense of what it's like to learn in other cultures. And particularly I was interested in what it's like to get feedback in other cultures. I talked to an emergency room doctor who had been trained as an elite ballerina before she went to medical school. And she said to me, you know, in the dance world, critique is highly prized. So I tried to imagine hearing that from a medical student or a resident. And I asked her to just elaborate on that a little bit. So she said the expected thing, which is that critique for a dancer, it's the only way you can really imagine advancing and developing is to have someone watch what you do and offer a critique that can help you to improve. And she also said something that I thought was a little bit more interesting and more unexpected, which was that critique is a kind of a tacit endorsement of your potential as a dancer. She said that the worst thing that a dancer could hear from a teacher is, "That was lovely." Because "that was lovely" kind of implies that the teacher can't even really be bothered to invest in creating critique that's going to be useful for that individual. It sort of suggests that the teacher doesn't even really think that the potential is there. It's a very different way to think about critique, or what we probably call in medicine negative feedback. What was interesting when I talked to her a little bit about her experience in medicine is that her comfort with critique as a dancer didn't really translate to her being overly comfortable with receiving critique as an emergency room, emergency medicine resident. And so that's an interesting conundrum, because we have tended to view the feedback problem as an individual challenge. We focused a lot of attention on getting teachers to give better feedback. And increasingly, we've started to think, wouldn't it be great if we could train learners to be better seekers of feedback? Or maybe we could actually try to change our admissions procedures so that we just get people into the field who are already good at kind of seeking and receiving and using feedback. And I'm going to argue that actually medicine is chock full of these people. We have them already. And the challenge is not so much the individuals as the culture and the setting and the environment that we place them into. So I'm going to be talking about learning culture, and I just want to define what I mean by it. So learning culture is the customs, the practices, the beliefs, and the values that characterize how a profession or a discipline organizes the learning of its own trainees. When we talk about learning culture, it asks us to shift our perspective on learning. So I'm a neurologist, and my initial view of learning was, as you might expect, learning is something that occurs up here in the brain, in the mind of an individual learner. And it is. I mean, there's an element of learning that is a very individual cognitive process. But the idea of learning culture asks us to adopt a sociocultural perspective on learning, which says that learning actually occurs out here. Learning occurs as people interact with one another. Learning occurs as individuals gradually become members of a professional community. And as they do that, they adopt the beliefs and the customs and the practices and the values of that community. Learning is a process of enculturation. So if you buy that, then that also means that we need to really start paying attention to culture, because we can see that it makes a big difference to how learning takes shape. So this is a shift in perspective, and it's one that I think is really timely and necessary. I was talking to the group earlier this afternoon about how frustrating the relative lack of progress, for example, around feedback has been over the last 30 years. lots and lots that has been written and lots of training that has been given to people to try to get them to be better givers of feedback, or perhaps to get people to be better users or seekers of feedback. And yet, learners keep telling us that the quality and quantity of feedback in medical training remains really suboptimal. And so I think that part of our problem has just been misdirected efforts. When you direct all of your efforts at the individuals, and you don't pay much attention to the culture in which they have to work, and to the way in which that culture supports or constrains their ability to do the things that they've been trained to do, then often you just don't get the kind of impact that you would hope for. So I've used in my own research a sociocultural perspective a lot, and that really is a perspective that alerts me to look beyond the individual and to look at what their behavior and what their experience tells us about the culture in which they are working. I must say, culture is a hard thing for an insider researcher to see. So I started medical school in 1986, which means I've been part of this culture for more than I haven't been. And as a result, that's a challenge for a researcher to actually appreciate the things in the culture that are unusual, because those are the things that we really need to be able to grab onto in order to understand why things unfold the way they do. So one of the approaches I've taken is to compare our culture in medicine with learning cultures from other disciplines, and to use those comparisons to shine a light on our own culture and to start to see the ways in which it is somewhat singular and somewhat strange. So I'll just give you an example to tell you what I mean. I have spent time with music students to try to just get a picture of what is the culture of learning in that discipline. And this will not be unfamiliar to anyone who's ever taken a music lesson, but I'll give you a sense of what musicians will tell you. Learning is by lesson in music. The milestones of development are lessons with a teacher, and then hours spent alone in a practice room trying to incorporate the lessons from the teacher in preparation for the next lesson. Musicians actually don't tend to harp on their actual performances as a really key part of their development. They maybe teach them something about managing stage fright or about stage presence, but the actual learning of the skill of being a musician doesn't tend to occur in those performance moments. Musicians talk about aspiring to excellence. Actually, they talk about aspiring to a kind of a transcendent level of performance, better than they thought was possible. They really don't talk about competence. That's probably because competent musicians are unemployed. It's actually not a very satisfactory endpoint for a musician. Music has a really clear sense of what an expert instructor is. And it's not always the same person. In fact, very often it's not the same person as an expert performer. Musicians will tell you that expert performers don't always make expert teachers, and that it's an entirely different skill set. And they'll often judge a music teacher by the quality of that teacher's students' performances and achievements. And musicians really embrace the idea of career-long coaching. If you were Canada's top opera singer and you just landed a new role, you would probably get on the phone to your vocal coach to start working with a coach on preparing for that role. It's just natural, regardless of the stage of career that you're at. So all of that seems very normal in that domain. But it allows us to see some of the things that we do in medicine in a new light. Medicine is not about learning by lesson. Medicine tends to be about learning by doing. Medical people will tell you things like, we learn by being thrown into the fire, by having to sink or swim. And a lot of those sink or swim moments that people identify as being key moments in their development occur without a teacher in sight. It often is at the moment where people are forced to do things on their own that they really latch onto as being important. Medicine does have, of course, a discourse of competence. We're part of it today, and that's maybe not surprising when outcomes like patient safety are important. Medicine doesn't, I don't think, have an archetype of the expert instructor in a way that we can easily separate it from the expert clinician. So most of us, as we are looking to who do we trust, as a teacher, we tend to trust the people who are the best performers at the job that we're aspiring to do. And even though there's lots of evidence that self-assessment is flawed in medicine, we do have a culture that tends to encourage it. And that is that we have a very clear separation between what I'd call the educational phase of a career and the practice phase of a career, with very little overlap. Once people graduate from the educational phase, they very, very rarely get on the phone to call somebody to come and do some coaching with them. So music is just one example. If you imagine the range of different types of human performance, it's not surprising that a whole range of different learning cultures have developed, to some extent fit for purpose, to try to prepare people to either work in an operating room or play in an orchestra, swim at the Olympics, or teach kids math. These are different kinds of performances, and they require different skills, and they require a different approach to teaching and learning. So what does any of this have to do with assessment and coaching and feedback? I want to just give a couple of examples of the ways in which our culture may influence these pedagogical tools. So let's start with feedback. I've spent a lot of my research life studying feedback, and a couple of characteristics of feedback I would say travel well across learning cultures. You would be hard-pressed to find a culture whose learners did not value feedback that was credible and constructive. Credible feedback is feedback that a learner believes, that they can trust. Constructive feedback is feedback they can use and that they can act upon. And both features are necessary regardless of whether you're a musician or a doctor in training. But the culture part comes in the fact that the very definition of credible and constructive is culturally determined. So let's go back to the music example for a minute. When we look for credible feedback, we look for it to come from a credible source. In music, a credible source is an expert instructor, not necessarily an expert performer. In medicine, a credible source tends to be an expert performer. And so there's one just culturally determined difference. Even though credibility is important, credibility looks quite different. The other thing that's different is that different cultures offer different degrees of support for the exchange of feedback that characteristically has credibility and constructiveness. So there are calls, for example, for medicine to become a feedback culture, as if you can just sort of snap your fingers and make a culture over from one thing to another. But it is useful to examine cultures of learning that I do consider to be feedback cultures, and to say, well, what do they do? Structurally, what do they do? How do they organize themselves to make the exchange of useful feedback possible? So I would argue that sports and dance and music are fundamentally feedback cultures, and they do a few things that make that possible. One is that they embed direct observation. Athletes will tell you if the coach isn't watching you all the time and yelling at you, they're not doing their job. And I've asked groups of music students how often they get feedback on their performance of a piece that the teacher wasn't actually in the room to hear them perform. Right, they don't know what you're talking about. They just sort of say to me, how is that possible? And I think, oh, that's possible, we kind of do it. Feedback cultures also tend to believe in nurturing relationships. A lot of people, if you've had a music teacher, will have worked with that music teacher over an extended period of time. Same with sports coaches. And one of the affordances of that is that a shorthand can kind of develop for difficult conversations. And feedback cultures stress development over judgment. Medicine actually struggles in all of these areas, not because we're badly intended, but because our system is not necessarily set up to allow it. Teachers and learners work in parallel often, each doing clinical work, rather than one observing the other. It makes direct observation quite difficult and scarce at times. And some of our organizational decisions make the building of relationships quite difficult. I don't know if there's anyone in the room who is an internal medicine resident, but internal medicine residents may be faced with working with a different supervisor every week for their 3 core years. It's hard to find a lasting relationship in which that kind of trust can develop. So feedback cultures really embed the idea of coaching. And coaching, as you'll hear from others, is attracting a lot of attention in medicine. in part because it just seems so intuitive. You've got comments like from Atul Gawande in 2011 where he just said, well, top athletes and singers have coaches, shouldn't you? And so this actually is another great opportunity to look carefully at culture and to say there are some ways in which coaching approaches seem very useful, but how effectively do they translate to the medical environment? And what are some of the challenges that we might encounter in our attempts to translate it? Well, there's a couple of translation problems that I can see. So the world of sports and music, coaching cultures, is actually fairly controllable. The world of medicine in which we're trying to put coaching is quite chaotic. And so coaching for us would occur here in these kinds of settings. Real clinical settings, with real patients, with real problems, where care has to be provided and the stakes for failing are high. And that's a complicated situation to put a coaching approach which depends on learners' ability to be vulnerable, to put their failings on display, to be analyzed and to be critiqued. And we have another problem, which is that we tend to blur together certain roles in medicine in ways that are problematic. So in sports, this is a quote from a study that I recently did with my colleague Corey LaDonna. And one of our participants said, in sports, a coach can't all of a sudden set foot on the ice or on the tennis court and actually start playing. It's true. Coaches can actually debrief what happened, but no matter what disaster is unfolding on the field, the coach usually has to just make some notes and hope to make something useful of it afterward. In medicine, coaches are players, and they're playing concurrent with the coaching work that they're doing, and sometimes they have to step in and take over. And sometimes they have to do that because it would be unsafe not to, and sometimes they have to do that just because they like being a player, or because they think that they're a better player than the person that they're coaching, and this is a moment that demands a better player. So it's a challenge. It's not a failing of our culture, but it is a feature of it that unless we're aware of, we may struggle to get coaching to do what we want it to do. I think at its heart, coaching demands a kind of a security between teacher and learner, between coach and learner, that they understand that both of them are there and are oriented toward the learner's development. Coaching relationships work well when both people are really on the same page about that we have created a safe environment that can be focused on learner development. And so we have to think about how do we actually make that happen in medicine. The last thing I want to touch on is assessment and feedback and the impact of culture of this interesting blurring of the lines between the two that we characteristically do in medicine, I think more so than in some of these other fields. In medicine, we often ask the same supervisor with the same learner around the same task to do both assessment and feedback. They're related, of course. It's very difficult to give somebody feedback without having done something of an assessment of the performance that you've just seen, but they fundamentally have different purposes. Assessment is about judgment, and feedback is about development. And it can be difficult to blend those two things together in a way that really resonates with learners. This is not, I don't think, some easily remedied cultural curiosity. We can look longingly to music and sports and say, well, they don't blend the two together, and so we should separate them too. But actually, there are some very good reasons that our culture blends the two together. And I think they include the fact that medical teachers have accountabilities beyond just to that student. They're responsible to the patient. They have a responsibility to the community, to the profession, to the public. And all of those competing responsibilities mean that they not only have to invest their energy in trying to develop learners as best they can, but they also have to judge the quality of the learner so that they can ensure that only safe care is being provided. Music teachers don't have to do that. So this is not something that we can just change or fix. But CBME, I think, raises the stakes on that. CBME is grounded in the idea of programmatic assessment, where we can assemble an an accurate picture of how a learner is performing by summing together multiple moments of low-stakes formative assessment to create a moment of high-stakes summative judgment. The affordance of that is that that summative judgment should be more accurate and more trustworthy than what we've had before. But the risk is that every single moment, even the ones that we intend to be coaching moments, might be perceived by learners as an assessment moment, a moment of judgment. And what's the problem with that? The problem is that all of us tend to behave a little differently if we think we are being assessed. And so as a result, we may not, if we're not careful, we may not be actually capturing moments that are quite as authentic as we might hope for. I want to just end with a comment about culture that is perhaps a little more hopeful. I presented at the beginning one definition of culture, and it's a fairly common one, the idea of the shared values and practices of a group of individuals. But there are actually multiple different perspectives on what culture is. In the organizational literature, there's been a gradual move away from thinking of culture as something that an organization is, and toward thinking of culture as something that an organization has. And the difference there is then that when we view culture as something that an organization has, we start to see it as dynamic and potentially malleable, something that can be influenced by the individuals that are part of it, something that can shift, and something that might be thought of as a set of resources that could be tapped into or harnessed in order to achieve certain strategic aims. Now that sounds like organizational science. Can we use culture to try to improve our bottom line? But I think there's a lesson for medicine which says that if we can understand our culture, then we can start to figure out how we might make strategic use of it in order to tap into the values that are really critical to the profession, and to actually use those to help drive forward some of these learning innovations that we hope to succeed with. Thank you.